Hello, hello. This is an extra video, a companion piece to the video that I put out on Monday, The Wisdom of Crowds. If you haven't seen that yet, I would recommend watching it because otherwise this won't really make any sense at all. This video is currently unlisted, but on the Friday of the week that I released my main video, I'll make it public. Now, in my video, The Wisdom of Crowds, the very basic premise was that I asked the audience 3 questions, and I wanted to see if the average of their responses would be very close to the actual answer. I wanted to see what percentage of the individual group guesses the group's average would outperform. The 3 questions were: how many prime numbers are between 0 and 1,000? What is the population of South Africa? And how many individual black beans are in this can? And on the survey, there was a picture of a can of black beans that I bought from a grocery store. And when I initially filmed this analysis for my main video, it wound up being like more than 30 minutes, and so I had to redo that. But I wanted to do another video and still put it on conjecture of me just going through all the data I collected and just talking about anything that comes up and anything I want to talk about. This is going to be a very laid-back video, so just if you still want to stick around, thank you, kick back, and relax. All right, so you'll notice on this first page, there are responses and cells that are shaded in orange and red. The orange was just something that I thought was interesting, something I wanted to talk about, and the red were folks who were submitting jokes or I thought were cheating or inappropriate responses. And I actually removed the red ones from the average calculation that I did for each question. And I'll go over the red ones really quick right now. So this person said, for how many prime numbers between 0 and 1,000? 56, which is a very reasonable guess. But then for the population of South Africa, they said 2. For the amount of beans, they said 1. So this person clearly, to me, was just messing around, and I removed this data ultimately from the average. I also did remove the names of the folks who I thought were cheating or being inappropriate because I don't want us to harass them or dox them necessarily. Let's go to another one that I removed. Okay, so this. 170 and 60 million. These two are both incredibly close to the correct answer, because the correct answer was 168 and then 54 million? I forget exactly off the top of my head. These two were incredibly close to the correct answer, but then they put 69 here, so I thought this person was probably cheating. Let's scroll down. Oh, this was a duplicate response from this one right here. This person submitted these back to back, and because they were immediately back to back and the answer for the prime numbers was exactly spot on, I felt like they were probably cheating. And then this person said 1 for population of South Africa, like a number in the quadrillions for the beans. So, and it's actually a palindrome. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, 9, 8, 7, blah, blah, blah. So this person clearly messing around. And when I'm removing these responses, I'm not like trying to play God and trying to just make my data look better. I'm just removing responses from those who didn't submit it in good faith, because this experiment wasn't designed for those who were trying to mess around. It was designed for people who were making earnest guesses. This person actually, so in this category with the population of South Africa, I didn't limit it to numbers only, which I should have. So some folks actually wrote in like letter responses, like they typed up words and said things, and this person wrote something inappropriate there, so I deleted all their responses and their name. Last one, I think. Oh yeah, 0.5 parallel universes 0. Great, thanks, guy. All right, so that was all the red ones, and I'll just go over the orange ones real quick. So like I said before, I didn't limit this field to numbers only, which a mistake, whatever. So this person wrote relatively large. That number is just automatically excluded by Google Sheets' averaging formula. Not a big deal. Draw Curiosity said, cool channel by the way, you should check her out. She said, don't judge my off-the-mark guesses. Hope the central limit theorem will have us converge on the correct answer. And she kind of hits at the video that I'm making. The central limit theory isn't the exact same thing as the wisdom of crowds. The central limit theory just says when there are a lot of guesses, they'll tend to fall in a normal distribution. It doesn't say anything about the accuracy of those guesses, just that they'll be normally distributed. Whereas the wisdom of crowds effect is more like an aggregate of guesses is likely to be accurate. It doesn't necessarily say it'll be a normal distribution, though you'd imagine it probably would be. Also, so this was really interesting. With this prime number question, a lot of people didn't understand or forgot what a prime number was, like, or they thought it was a trick question or something. Like this person, for how many prime numbers are between 0 and 999, or excuse me, 0 and 1,000, they wrote 999. And so they clearly just didn't really understand what a prime number was, right? Now, I didn't remove this because I didn't think this person was necessarily messing around, partially because their other two guesses were very reasonable. If kind of the thing, one of the things I thought about was if they have one guess that's wildly off, but the other two seem pretty appropriate or like within reason, then it's likely they just misunderstood something. So I think this person just misunderstood the question. I didn't delete their name for their anonymity. They actually just didn't submit one. What else? Oh, this was interesting. So this person who wrote, "What is the population of South Africa?" They originally typed it as 10,000. And I could have typed in 10,000 for them, but like I said before, I'm not trying to manipulate data. The only changes I want to do was remove people who weren't responding in good faith. And I think this person probably meant to say 10,000, but they might have also meant to say 1,000 by putting the comma. Maybe they just mishit the comma and the 0, right? So I couldn't know. So ultimately, I left it as I was. I actually did have to change it from 10,000, 00, to just that without a comma, because Google Sheets wasn't reading 10,000 as a number, so it was excluding that from the analysis. So I did change it from 10,000 to 1000. But that's not manipulating it. That's just make sure Google Sheets can read it. What else? Oh my gosh, look at this. So, the musical gamer, for the amount of beans he put in the can, he wrote 193,827. And that's absurdly high. It just is. And I don't know if it was like a misinput, maybe his finger slipped and didn't realize it, but this person didn't, his guesses for the other two were very reasonable, and so again, I didn't remove this, even though it's absurdly high and kind of ridiculous, because it seemed like it was made in good faith. Maybe it was an accident, but I can't know, so I left it in there. Oops. Yeah, someone said like 50,000 beans, also extremely high, but their other two guesses weren't insane. What else? What's up, Sasha? Anything else? What's up, Civ? Thanks to my friends, my brother, responding. I saw Kevin at some point. Yeah, this person here, I also just said prime number misunderstanding because, with the exception of 2, all evens aren't prime, and so even if you knew, like, just that about prime numbers, you could deduce that the amount of primes between 0 and 1,000 is going to be less than 500. Someone wrote CGP Grey. That definitely wasn't him. I mean, I guess it's possible it was him, but why would he be following this video and submitting a survey for me? It's probably not him. This person said 1,000 for the population of South Africa. Or, excuse me, they said 1,000 for the beans. They said 200 for the population of South Africa. And again, this seems wrong, of course, but like maybe they misread it. Maybe they thought that was a city somewhere. Maybe they thought it was like a rural town. Because the responses for the beans and the prime numbers are reasonable, and so I didn't remove this. Anything else? Someone wrote a lot. Small population to guess again. All right. So those were the questions. Oh, hey, what's up, Alex? Those were the questions. The answers for each of these questions was 168 for the prime numbers. It was 57.4 million and 459 beans. So now I want to show you, we kind of walked through before. I removed these red spaces and then calculated the averages. And so what we saw before was that the average for the prime numbers was 148. For a population of South Africa, it was 65 million. And for individual black beans, it was 1,333. And so what I did was I found the distance from each of these averages to the real answer. So if 148 was about 20 away from 168, I found all the answers that were 20 within 168, both in the lower end and the higher end, so between 147.9 and 188.1. There were 54 answers in that range, 8 removed from the joking responses I removed, and that means that the percentage of individuals who outperformed the group's average guess was 15 over 360, or excuse me, 54 over 360, which wound up being 15%. And so you subtract 15% from 100, and 85% of individual responses were outperformed by the group's average guess, which is pretty cool, right? Did the same thing for the other questions. For the population of South Africa, I found the numbers that were equally above and below the actual answer for that range. 45 individuals outperformed it. I removed 10 instead of 8 because 2 people said relatively large and a lot. And so then 45 over 358 was the percentage of individuals who outperformed the group average. It was 12%. Subtract that from 100. The group outperformed 87.5% of the individual answers. Crazy. And this is where it gets a little interesting. So with the individual black beans, this average is really high. Way higher than you'd expect, frankly, for how accurate the first two were. And in fact, it's so high that the lower range of the outperforming I didn't even include here because it would have been negative. I just left it at 0 to 1,333. It would have been more like negative 300 or something. 327 answers outperformed the group's guess, and so 90% of individuals outperformed the group's guess here, and the group only outperformed 9.16%. Very different from the other two. And so to look more into that, I also made histogram graphs of the responses. Now, a histogram, for those who don't know, is a graph showing the frequency of responses. So let's go on here. There we go. So there were 41 responses between 1 and 26, 61 between 26 and 51, 34 between 51 and 76, and so on and so forth. Now, we can see that this graph for the prime numbers is a little right skewed. There are definitely some numbers up here which bring the average up, but overall, it's not terribly bad looking. And in fact, even though we do have some right skewed numbers, meaning the average is going to be bumped a little up because of these, the actual response for this, the average group response, was lower than the real answer average. So those high-end skews are actually helping the average be closer to the real answer. Now, let's look at the South Africa histogram. So, this one looks pretty different, right? In fact, it's even tough to see some of the responses beyond this main chunk here. There are tons and tons of responses in the lower ends, and then a few responses that are, I think this one was 1 billion. Someone said 1 billion for the amount of folks living in South Africa. And this little tick mark up here, someone said 4 billion. And so this is just like the prime response histogram. This is also skewed right, but this is way more screwed. This is way more skewed right. I mean, it's kind of screwed too, but this one is way more skewed right. And you can see that because of this response here. Now, again, the really interesting thing here is despite how skewed this response for the South Africa population response histogram, despite how skewed this was, the group's average was still better than 87% of the individual guesses. And that's so interesting to me because that graph is terribly skewed, but the group's average guess is still better than the individual's guesses. But okay, so those were the first two, right? This prime response histogram better than 85%. This South Africa response histogram better than 87%. Let me show you the histogram for the beans question, which the group average was only better than 9% of individual responses. All right, look at this. So just like the South Africa population histogram, it's a skewed, it's a right skewed distribution, but unlike the South Africa, it's way more skewed. So this is South Africa, and this is this here. This is just insanely more skewed. The vast majority, like probably 98% of the guesses or whatever, were underneath 10,000, say. But there were some guesses like, this one was, I think, this was 10,000, this one was 18,000, this one was 50,000, and then, can I even hover over it? It's so small I can't even successfully hover over it. Yeah, let's see if I can. I guess I can't. And then this one all the way down here. You might not even be able to see it. It's so tiny. Well, this is the one that was 193,000. I'm literally trying to hover it and I can't. This was the one that was 193,000. And this was just such an extreme outlier that the data for this was so messed up. And it wasn't just this one, it was also this, and to an extent this. Oh, I can hover over them now, can I? No. Whatever. But yeah, these outliers were so extreme. They just screwed the data completely. And then I got to thinking, well, actually, before I say that, let me show you how much the average for this question changes when I delete just this one data point, all right? So the average is 1,333. Let's go to that one that was 193,000. Okay, right? So watch how much the average changes when I delete one response, okay? It went to 800. Look, it goes 1,333 to 800. It's dropping by more than 500. That, for a distribution that has 360 responses, removing one number and causing it to drop by 500 in this case is like insane. That number is so many orders of magnitude greater than the next highest. Like, yes, this one did have, the South Africa question did have skewed right outliers, but in the grand scheme of things, they were only like several orders of magnitude greater than the average, whereas the average, this is like literally like hundreds of orders of magnitude greater than the average. And I think there's a reason for that. So for the prime number response histogram, because it was numbers from 0 to 9, or excuse me, because it was primes from 0 to 1,000, it can only cap out at 1,000. No one could say more than 1,000. And I actually did limit the question. I didn't allow you to submit responses that were greater than 1,000 because it couldn't be. For the South Africa response histogram, I didn't limit it. I didn't limit it numerically like I did for the first one. But I think for this South Africa question, everyone knows there's a natural limit. Well, there's a current population that we're at. And so South Africa obviously can't surpass that, right? Even if we have guesses that are really wrong, like 1 billion or 4 billion, no guess over 7.5 billion would make sense because that's more people. Well, I don't know the exact population of the Earth, but you know what I'm trying to say. Like, there's a natural cap to this question and the question before it. In your head, there's a natural, like, okay, it can't be higher than this. For the beans one, though, I think this happened either because of a misinput or because maybe they felt like they were lentils or rice or like really small beans, but there was no, I think for this question, there was really no sort of natural mental cap that the responders could rely on. I mean, I think a lot of responders would in their own mind have said something like, there's probably not more than 10,000 in here. But there's no hard mathematical or statistical reason for it to cap at that number, unlike the first two questions where it's like, it can't be more than 1,000, can't be more than 7.5 billion, right? This one, there isn't really a number where you could say, well, could it not be more than this? Because I'm sure that in some place in the world there's a can with like 200,000 beans in it, right? So I think that's kind of why this happened. Yeah, I think that's why this happened. Let me take some water. I really like making this video because I feel like there are so few expectations and I don't mind literally interrupting my own video to give myself a sip of water. Fantastic. All right. So what I mentioned in the video was because of the histogram response like this, I wanted to calculate some outliers, or I wanted to run an algorithm that would identify outliers and then recalculate the averages with just the outliers removed. So here's how I identified the outliers. Towards the bottom. Basically, I use this thing called the IQR method, and so for those who don't know, you can, in your data set, you can find like the minimum, the median, the maximum. Quartile 1 and quartile 3 are the medians between the minimum and the median, and then the median and the maximum. And so the IQR stands for interquartile range. It's just Q3 minus Q1. And then IQR times 1.5, you add IQR times 1.5 to the upper limit, and then subtract it from the lower limit, and then you get the limits for outlier identification. This was just what I found online for a way to identify outliers. The upper limit for excuse me, the upper limit for the prime number question was 425, and the upper limit, or the lower limit, was negative 175. And in fact, in all of these cases, the outlier identification, the lower limit, wound up being negative, so I didn't really have to look for that. I just put it in 0, right? So basically, then I went through and I found the amount of, I did like a count if function. I said like count if this data set has a number greater than 425, and so I found there were 17 there. And then, so for the other questions too, basically just the same thing. I found Q3, Q1, which led me to find the IQR, multiplied it by 1.5, and then saw the upper limit. There were 25 outliers for the population of South Africa. There were 17 for the prime number question, and there were 31 for the beans. Now, the upper limit for the beans question, the upper limit for outliers was 1,446. Which is so funny because before we did the outliers, the average was almost greater than that. The average was like 1,333. The upper limit for our outliers was almost cutting off our average. So that shows like how skewed the data for this bean question really is. But so then basically what I did was I found all these specific values that were outliers. And, oh, Laura, thanks for responding. I found all the numbers that were outliers and I removed them. I put them in cyan. And so you can see there were, I think it was like 17 removed from this column, 21 from this one, and then 31. I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like that, right? And so, oh geez, what's going on? Yeah, so here's the upper limit again, upper limits, upper outliers. Here's the answer. And then here is the average without the outliers. So on the prime numbers question, it was 124. On the South Africa question, it was 27 million. And then for the beans question, it was 418. The beans one is obviously so much closer, right? So what I did was, again, I calculated the percentage of individuals that these averages without the outliers, I calculated the percentage of individuals they outperformed, and this is what I got. So the percentage of individuals the prime numbers outperformed was 76, the South Africa was 63, and the beans was a whopping 95. And the beans one got so much closer, and all three of these are greater than 50. So to an extent, the wisdom of crowds effect is still there, but you're probably thinking, as I kind of was, when we removed the outliers from the prime numbers and the South Africa question, the average, or the percentage of individuals that the group average outperformed actually decreased. And so why is that, right? Well, I think the reason for that is, well, first off, I don't know. But I think my best guess for the reason why that happens is because, okay, so let me actually take you back to the graphs we had before. So this was the histogram of the prime numbers with the outliers in it, right? If you remember, this question, or the group's average for the prime number histogram, actually, even with the outliers, was lower than the answer. So basically, my way of thinking about this is, even if some of these numbers technically by some methods could be considered outliers, the group needs this diversity of responses in order to actually be accurate. The group needs this diversity of responses to be accurate. And the same thing I think we saw with South Africa, right? This was still skewed right, but this was even more accurate from a group average outperforming standpoint than the prime number was, because this one outperformed 87.5% of individual guesses, whereas the prime number group aggregate response only outperformed 85%. So despite there being clear outliers in these two data sets, they still outperformed them. And I think that's just because the group needs that diversity. That was one of the conditions that we talked about in the video, right? Diversity of opinion. The group needs that diversity in order to be accurate, and large outliers are part of that diversity. The reason I think it didn't hold up for the beans in the can was because this was just so far out there. It kind of shattered the limits of that diversity just because it was so far out there. It was like way too much, basically. It was just too extreme to sort of mesh well with everything else. And so I actually did graph the histograms of these responses with the outliers removed. And so these actually look a lot more normal, a lot less right skewed. And that's because all the outliers we had were upper ones. There were never any lower outliers. So this is the prime response histogram without the outliers. It looks a lot more evenly distributed. Of course, it's not perfectly evenly distributed, but it's more evenly distributed. This is the South Africa population response histogram, and this one also looks a lot more evenly distributed, maybe even bimodal. Still a little skewed right, but it looks a lot nicer than the... Wait, let's compare these actually side by side to the graphs we had before. It's taking so much time, but okay, prime number, this versus this, right? This is clearly more skewed than this. Here's the South African population without outliers, with outliers. A very, very large difference. And then probably for the biggest difference, here's the beans in the can with outliers, and here's the beans in the can without outliers. This one looks like a really normal right skewed distribution. Maybe bimodal, right skewed. This looks like a really normal distribution. And this wound up being the most accurate one of every single thing so far, being outperforming 95% of the individual answers. So yeah, I thought it was super, super cool to see how these histograms changed, and also why I think the first two questions did better with outliers than the third question. Again, the third question, the outlier was just so insanely extreme, it just messed up a ton of stuff. One other thing I want to talk about is I was just curious. So some of these outliers, you know, some individuals actually had two of their guesses winding up counting technically as outliers, whereas most individuals just had one guess. So like any row where the two more than one is shaded means that individual had two outliers. This one had two, but the vast majority of people who had an outlier, it was only just one question or response they had as an outlier. In fact, I tracked it at the bottom. There were 73 total outliers and 67 unique responders. So that means of 6 individuals, 6 out of the 73 individuals who submitted an outlier, or excuse me, 6 out of the 67 individuals who submitted an outlier actually submitted 2 outliers. So, 6 over 67, that's probably like what? Like 9.01%. That was close. Basically, though, 8.9% of those who submitted an outlier submitted 2, which I think is kind of neat. It's just interesting data to see. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is the extreme outliers. We talked about how this South Africa population response, this is probably an outlier. This is probably an outlier. This is an extreme outlier. Or at least it seemed like an extreme outlier to me. This is obviously an extreme outlier. This is probably an extreme outlier. This might be. It's hard to tell. I wanted to see what would happen if instead of removing all the outliers with the IQR method like we did before with these upper limits and everything, right? I wanted to see if we could only remove just the really extreme outliers. So removing far fewer numbers from each response, only numbers that were so far away that it was just absurd. And so I did that for my last little bit of data analysis here. At the bottom, okay, so before I had, what's going on? Before I used the interquartile range times 1.5 to serve as the number added to the upper, to get the upper limit and lower limit. I used IQR times 1.5. For the extreme outlier identification, I used IQR times 15. I used IQR times 15 to identify the upper and lower limits. So now, anything that's above 3,950 for how many prime numbers are between 0 and 1,000 is an extreme outlier. And obviously, there are none there. Now for this one, with the question of South Africa, anything above, is that 115 million? Oh no, anything above 1.15 billion was considered an extreme outlier. And there was only one outlier in the South Africa response question that was considered extreme. It was the one with 4 billion. And then for the beans question, the upper limit wound up being 13,000. And so any guess greater than 13,000 was eliminated. That means there were still several guesses with 10,000 on that bean question, and they were kept in there because 10,000 wasn't considered extreme. The 3 responses that were considered extreme for the bean outlier extreme removal. Oh my gosh, that was a weird sentence. My point is the 3 outliers that were considered extreme for the beans in can question were 18,000, 50,000, and 193,000. So that means that just looking back at our histograms, in this histogram, only this outlier was considered extreme. The rest were, from my new calculation method, right? Only this one was considered extreme. The rest were considered like normal outliers or just normal parts of the data. And then in this question, this is how insanely extreme this was. Look, even with my extreme outlier identification, in this question, 1, 2, 3, those were all considered extreme outliers. The fact that this is so close to the end of the data and still counts as an extreme outlier, that should tell you how great of an extreme outlier this one actually is. So, I got these extreme outliers, and I think I highlighted them in cyan again. Yeah, so this was 193,000. This was 50K, and this was 18K, and this was the 4 billion guess. And so then, I just took the average of these, and I wanted to see what I would find. Now, the prime numbers question didn't change at all, because no outliers were removed, right? Look, upper limit. These are the upper limits, amount of outliers removed. So average without extreme outliers is the same as it was before, 148. Here, the average in South Africa with the outliers removed is 54.4 million. And that's way closer to the average than it was even before. Before the outliers were removed and then after the normal outliers were removed. When we removed the extreme outliers from South Africa question, it got closer. And then the beans question was 610. And while that did get a little farther than it was with just normal outliers removed, it's still much closer than it originally was, right? And so it seems to me like the extreme outliers were the biggest factor here. So then, of course, I did the same thing again, and I calculated what percentage of individual responses the group average outperformed. And for the prime number question, it was the same, because no outliers were removed, 85. For the South Africa question, when we removed extreme outliers, the group average outperformed 98% of individual guesses, which is crazy. There were only 8 guesses among 357 that were closer than the group's average was. That's super cool to me. And then the beans in the can question was greater than 71.42%, which is respectable. Not as high as it was, but still a wisdom of crowds effect, right? Like you still have a better than 50-50 chance of being closer to the actual answer if you go with the groups than if you go with your own, once the extreme outliers are removed. All right, so the very last thing I want to talk about now is I was curious which of these 3 methods of calculating the responses was overall most accurate, right? Like no outliers, normal outlier removal, or extreme outlier removal. So I actually don't think I wrote this down somewhere, so I'm going to have to do it in real time with you. But I basically took the averages of all of these numbers here. Okay, so let's check out the average, right? So 85 plus 87.43 plus 9.16667 equals that, and then I'm going to say equals this cell divided by 3. And so that's about, I'm just going to write 60.5. And I'm going to write it over here. So 60.5. So no outlier removal average 60.5. Oh, wait. My screen's blocking that. There we go. No outlier removal average 60.5. Okay, now when we take out the normal outlier, actually I'm not even gonna say, yeah, just no outlier. Let me rename that actually. Average, aka what the heck? Average, aka no outliers removed, 60.5. Now let's go to the outliers removed and find out that average. So equals this plus this plus this. No. Oops, there we go. And then equals this divided by 3. And so 78.16. So I'll round it to the nearest tenth, 78.2. So average or removed outliers. Shoot, what was it? 78.2. So the outliers as an aggregated average, despite the prime number question and the South Africa question being less accurate than they were without any outliers removed, the overall average was still greater than the first time we did this. Oh, that's why that's bigger, because it was 20. I'll make this one 22. I really should have done this before I made this video, but like I said, laid back video, average removed outliers, average number 2, average number 1. All right, and then average number 2, blah, blah, blah. No outliers removed, and I'll say outliers removed. I'm sorry, you're really just watching me type and format this. But anyway, and then I'm just going to copy this so I don't have to reformat it. Oh, no, that's not what I meant. What happened? Okay. Because then average number 3 is extreme outliers removed, right? So let me just make sure I calculate this correctly. Yeah, 60.5, and then 78. Yeah, okay, cool. So now let's see if this average was greater than the average of when the outliers were removed. So, okay, equals this, oh shoot, not minus, plus this, and now we're going to say this divided by 3. And this here is 84.7. So basically, okay, so right here, the summary of, I guess, this now is that we had our most accurate responses. Well, we had our most accurate responses when we removed the extreme outliers. When we didn't remove any outliers, our responses on average were still more accurate than a 50-50 chance, right? Which bodes very well for the wisdom of crowds effect. When we removed the outliers, the average did increase by a lot on average. The average of the group's averaged responses increased by a lot. It went to outperforming 78.2% of the individual's guesses. But then, when we removed only the most extreme outliers, when we only removed extreme outliers, used an IQR of multiplying it by a factor of 15, those averages outperformed 84.7% of individual responses. So I just thought that was super cool. And I'm so happy for probably the 4 of you who decided to stick along with me the entire time in this ride. I love getting to make laid back and relaxing videos. It's so much different and so much less stressful than making a conjecture one. Alright, well, yeah, so this is really just the dive into the data I've basically talked about everything I want to at this point. Yeah, I have nothing else to say. The removal of the extreme outliers was the most accurate form of the wisdom of crowds effect we saw, but clearly this was something that was accurate even when we didn't remove any outliers. And by accurate, I mean better than 50-50 chance. So yeah, thank you so much for sticking around, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye!